Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Diane Whitehead, and I'm President and CEO of Childhood Education International. We're a global nonprofit consulting service helping governments, NGOs, education institutions, and school systems and businesses design and implement innovative, inclusive, and sustainable solutions to support children's education and well-being, which is why we're so pleased today to have this dedicated session that we believe will put forth some innovative ideas from a global thought leader. Today, we will be interviewing Dr. Peter Senge, who many of you may have heard of from his exceptional work in organizational development, and particularly in systems thinking. Dr. Senge has received acclaim not only as one of the top business strategy influencers of our time, but also as one of the leading voices for ways to create a better future for us all, including his work in systems and systems thinking, which helps us all to move from thinking of things in parts towards thinking about how those parts contribute to a whole. But before we interview Dr. Senge, I'd like to set the stage a little for why this topic is so important in early childhood, for early childhood leaders and educators and to all those who support the development of young children. We've heard a lot about in early childhood discussions about systems these days and systems thinking. And in that sense, we're talking about sort of the support for the delivery of the services that come together to support young children, healthcare, nutrition, education, child safety, protection, and other critical services. However, our focus today is somewhat less on the systems within the early childhood development arena and more focused on children's innate capacity for systems thinking. Childhood is where systems thinking naturally begins. So, how do we nurture children's innate ability to think from a systems perspective? Children will need to rely on being systems thinkers to understand much of the very complex world that we live in today and to help them guide them through their future, to understand the big picture and use systems thinking to solve complex problems. So with that, we'll welcome Dr. Senge, who is a systems scientist, author at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he is an acclaimed senior lecturer within the Sloan School of Management. He's authored many books and articles and is perhaps best known for his influential book, The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization. He also founded the MIT Society for Organizational Learning and co-founded the Academy for Systems Change. And I was also someone who read The Fifth Discipline, Dr. Senge, so thank you for that seminal work. Throughout his career, Dr. Senge has been asking, how do we create the conditions for people to work together at their best, cultivating innate systems intelligence that is our birthright, but is all but lost in our modern culture? Dr. Senge understands deeply that people all live within systems and we create these systems. So the best way we can create them is so they're human-centered and designed to support healthy and productive relationships with compassionate approaches as central to how we relate to each other. This inspired him to co-found, and he's currently a senior advisor as well, at the MIT Center for Systems Awareness, a global organization that serves as a collaborative platform and a space for people who want to engage not only in systems thinking, but in compassionate systems change, so they can collaborate, explore, and truly learn from each other. Compassion and in our human interactions are actually central to healthy systems that support all people's well-being, understanding and listening to each other. And you'll hear more about compassionate systems and leadership in today's discussion. Dr. Senge will be interviewed by Faye Snodgrass, an educator and executive who leads the Global Educational Community, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing learner-centered global education. She's been an executive director of an international honor society in education for many years and has spent her career at the intersection of education and sustainability, working along UNESCO's international network of teacher education institutions. In 2018, Faye was introduced to the MIT Center for Systems Awareness, and that changed her greatly. She looked at the compassionate systems framework in local elementary school, and she became inspired to become a compassionate systems master practitioner. Faye continues to share her knowledge with educators and education leaders in schools and with other stakeholders across the field. I'm proud to say that Faye is also a former board chair of Childhood Education International, a member of our advisory council. So thank you so much. And with that, I will turn it over to Faye and welcome Dr. Senge.
Thank you so much, Diane. It truly is an honor and a privilege to talk with you, Peter. As you know, this work is very meaningful to me and to so many others. Perhaps to start out our conversation, I know many educators are familiar with social emotional learning, but far fewer have encountered the idea of compassionate systems leadership. How would you describe systems awareness and why you believe developing systems intelligence is important in schools and early childhood settings?
Thanks, Faye. It's good to be together today. Well, from the point of view of someone like me, I'm going to respond in a particular way and then try to kind of also backfill. What would that mean if you come into this from the SEL or social emotional learning perspective? Before I had ever heard of social emotional learning, we had a lot of experience. Mainly the we is a euphemistically way for me to point at some remarkable educational innovators, mostly teachers in primary and secondary school, who were taking basic tools and ideas that had a long history at MIT and translating them and putting them to work in the classroom. Initially, those of us at MIT who encountered this were, I would say, intrigued. Probably didn't have much of a clue why it mattered. It was interesting. But the key to me was, as you would expect for really masterful educators, their kind of capacity to take something that, let's just say, was developed in a university setting and really make it real, evoke the intuitive understanding that a 6 or 10 or 15-year-old might have of the same territory. Then create tools, pedagogies, methods for kind of integrating this into the classroom. Sometimes they called it systems thinking, sometimes they called it other things, but they were always kind of directed towards a simple idea, which eventually started to become very compelling to us all. And that is that kids get this. While particulars of any particular set of tool might be new or novel to them, the underlying idea, the sensibility, if you will, and the ability that follows from that to appreciate, see, conceptualize, and even analyze complex systemic phenomena was quite shocking to us. I remember the first time I visited a classroom in this network. This network was founded by a couple of philanthropies who got really excited about this possibility that systems awareness, systems thinking, what we eventually have come to call systems intelligence, could be a cornerstone of primary and secondary education. Visited a classroom with my wife in probably the mid-90s. It was in Tucson, Arizona. The story of it was really kind of funny. It was a mentor of mine and many of us, a man who had retired as the dean of the engineering school at MIT, had retired in Tucson. And he got up one morning, was out for a walked by a middle school, wandered into the middle school, asked to talk to the principal, He was, after all, the dean of the engineering school at MIT and really quite famous in history of education. His name is Gordon Brown, and he was instrumental in fundamental innovations in engineering education that MIT eventually became world famous for. Anyhow, so Gordon wandered into the middle school and said, "Hey, what are you doing with systems thinking in your kids?" And they went, "Huh?" Anyhow, that started a long journey that was really striking. When I first visited, it was that same middle school. It was probably about 5 or 6 years later. I walked into a seventh grade science class, either seventh or eighth grade science class. And first off, the first thing I noticed is there was no teacher in front. The kids were all working in little groups. The teacher was wandering around the class. It wasn't absent. He just wasn't lecturing. He wasn't, quote, teaching. Um, I found out eventually that the kids had a year-long project. A new set of trails were proposed for a state park on the outskirts of Tucson. They were going to lay out these trails in different ways, and there's a very complex set of issues. Depending on where you put the trails, the ecological impact, the benefit for people. Eventually, the kids started to realize that there were some indigenous burying grounds in this land. So where the trails go relative to sacred sites. Anyhow, the kids' year-long project in seventh grade science was to analyze different options for laying out the trail system and eventually make a presentation to the State Park Commission. That was seventh grade science. And I thought, whoa, this is not seventh grade science the way I remember it. They were so engaged. They were all sitting at their little Macintosh computers in groups of two or three, and in intense conversations. The teacher had developed a little software so they could literally lay out the trails and see different geographies they could cross through, and then analyze the consequences. Um, my wife and I were standing in the back watching this, and a couple kids pulled us over to said, "Hey, we're having a debate. My friend, I forget his name, thinks this trail network should go right here because it's beautiful views, and it'll create more traffic, therefore more revenues for the state. But I'm concerned that it comes within about a couple of 100 meters of these sacred burial sites, and I'm really worried of the sacrilegious impact of laying trails out by this, and of course protests that could come from native tribes in the area." Anyhow, it was fascinating. Needless to say, there was no simple answer to this question, but the engagement of these kids in such a real set of issues, the economics, the politics, the ecological impact, and the cultural sensitivity of designing a trail network. That was my introduction to systems thinking in education. And at the end of like an hour in the back of the classroom, we didn't stand for long because we got pulled into all these conversations with the kids because they really wanted someone to kind of be a sounding board for their debates they were having. At the end, we visited with the teacher. His name is Frank Draper, who's really quite a brilliant educator. I got to know Frank quite well. And he said, "Wow, this is pretty amazing." He said, "Yeah, they're pretty engaged. They've been in this now for about a month or two, and they have another 4 or 5 months to develop their proposals. And literally at the end of the year, they did presentations to the State Parks Commission, laying out the different options for the trail systems and the pluses and minuses." Um, so, and oh, by the way, then he said at the end, and we said, "Gee, those two kids, I forget their names, they were really into it." He said, "Yeah, those kids were our biggest behavior problems. Neither of them really showed up at school regularly, and when they were here, they were tended to be very disruptive, and not anymore." So that was kind of a clue to me on several levels. One, engaging kids in real issues. Project-based learning is the kind of generic term used for this, but real projects that have real meaning for them that don't have simple answers. This is not about finding the answer that's in the back of the quiz book. These are issues that are real. In other words, they don't have simple answers. Learning how to frame complex debates, learning how to inform highly politically charged conversations with points of view that are logically sound and consistent with the data and the way kids could analyze the situation. They were really helping the adults in a real situation deal with a very real issue. Real project-based learning, real projects. That was my entree. And we left that day I became a huge fan of the school. It was called the Orange Grove Middle School. Eventually, there was a couple of short films made from that school because a local filmmaker got as fascinated as we were about, wow, this does not look like school as we know it. That was an example of a variety of projects that were started in the mid to late 90s by a network that eventually became known as the Waters Foundation. That was the philanthropy that sponsored it. There were several, but that was the one that eventually really stayed with it. And they developed basically a network of high schools, middle and high schools, secondary schools around the country that collaborated on curriculum, on pedagogy, on sharing stories, and so on. And it was very clear that this really could work. Over the next 5 to 10 years, it was fascinating to watch how these tools kind of migrated upstream. What I mean by upstream, to the younger and younger learners. Not surprisingly, MIT tools, they have to be kind of redesigned for use in secondary education, tended to attract math and science teachers like Frank and others who were excited by the idea that, oh, made at MIT, so to speak. Um, but gradually over time, the diversity of educators grew, the diversity of ages really expanded, and particularly the work with the little kids was very compelling. Gradually, it became self-evident that children by the age of 4 or 5 understand what we call stocks and flows. In mathematics, it's called integration. It's the way flows accumulate in stocks and are the source of all dynamic change in systems. It's basically Newtonian mechanics. But you don't call it that for the 5-year-old. Every 5-year-old knows he can only put so much in a box. After all, the box gets full. They know what it means to accumulate stuff in a box. They know what it means to accumulate water in a pail. They know there's an inflow and an outflow. If there's a drain in the water, they can pretty quickly figure out that, well, the water rises if the inflow is above the outflow and vice versa. See, this is what I meant by the intuitive underpinnings. By the way, that confusion is one of the primary problems in our attempts to deal with global climate change. Very few people appreciate that the atmospheric gases, the greenhouse gases we're putting in the atmosphere, accumulate in the atmosphere exactly like water accumulates in a bucket. And the inflow exceeds the outflow, the accumulation rises, as I say, the greenhouse gas concentration rises until the inflow is reduced till it's equal to the outflow. Very few adults understand that solving climate change is not about stopping the growth in emissions. It's about lowering the rate of emissions in the world till it's below the rate at which carbon is removed from the atmosphere. So I'm just illustrating now these simple systems building blocks, which are very intuitive for kids, are enormously elusive when we deal with big complex issues. This is why this education is so not only possible, but important. So that's a long answer to your question, Faye, but it's the easiest way for me to reflect on my own journey. It was always stimulated by seeing the evidence of what kids could do, which I would say in hindsight today is vastly underestimated by educators, many of whom never had their own intuition cultivated in the way that's quite possible with kids.
Yeah, I had the same experience working with second graders in a low-income school, and I introduced a systems tool, and the teacher wasn't sure that the children understood it. And when she said, you know, what is an iceberg? And they quickly defined it, and she realized that they grasped the concept quite easily. I then proposed to them, there was a situation with school access to a courtyard that they really liked that was problematic during the summer months. And so they quickly took the tool and mapped the causes, proposed solutions, and shared their ideas successfully with the principal and solved the problem. So, you know, what does this tell us about how we approach this with with children in younger settings? You know, what are the entry points? Because they certainly get it perhaps quicker, as you just suggested, than the adults in the space.
Well, that's important to recognize, that last point you made there, which is the kids are never the problem. The adults are the problem. And it's a natural kind of a conundrum in that as educators, Very few of us were ever introduced to this when we were 5 or 6 or 8 years old. So it's very foreign territory to us. And the natural and very healthy, mental model of the teacher is I need to learn it first before I can teach it to the kid. Until I've mastered it, I can't stand up and teach algebra to kids if I don't know algebra. That's a very understandable and appropriate professional attitude. That said, it's completely inappropriate in this territory, where what you're really doing is trying to evoke an innate capacity, and you're faced with the conundrum that you didn't have that experience as a kid. This will be a totally different problem if those of us who are teaching in our 30s or 40s or 50s had the same process when we were a kid. We'd say, well, it's very easy. You get to put the kids to work on this or that, and just so you illustrate it, give them real problems, give them a few little kind of systems building blocks, and turn them loose. But of course, that's not much the way pedagogy usually operates. And it's in a territory that's by and large foreign and can be very off-putting for the educators. I think the first thing is to just be as honest as we can and recognize terms like systems thinking tend to be quite off-putting for an educator. They may kind of think it's curious. They have no clue what it means. It sounds very technical. The word system, as you illustrated, Diane, in your introduction, is usually used in a very different way. We have a system problem here. It means our computers aren't working, right? Or our tech, we need to get a tech expert in here. Or, hey, it's not my problem, it's the stupid system. I mean, this is probably the anchor use of the term system. Rules, regulations, bureaucracy, organization. How do we organize the system so it works well? These are perfectly legitimate problems, perfectly appropriate and completely different. The root system that we all grow up in is called family. We all grow up in families. What are families? They're a network of interdependent relationships amongst people that are very complex at the personal level. So we have a lot of emotion, a lot of, our own interpretations. I know you, you know me. Well, at least I know my model of you, you know your model of me. We have complex interpersonal habits. The way a father and a son have interacted for a few years starts to become very habitual for both. The observers see the habitual way the interaction occurs. They habituate in their own ways. So you might say human systems, like families, are networks of interacting, embedded, deeply emotional, personal habits, writ large. I'm just using this to illustrate. You see, everybody kind of knows that because we grow up in families. We wouldn't use the word system. The only reason we use it is because it has a long, rich kind of intellectual tradition in Western sciences. So it's kind of the anchor way that Western scientists for 250 years, if you go back to the history of engineering, tried to understand complex interdependent phenomenon, not by just looking at the isolated elements, but looking at how the elements were interacting and how those interactions formed webs, what we would call causal structures, which shaped how the whole system operated. So we've believe me, we've experimented with lots of different terms. We've never been able to find a better one than systems intelligence or systems thinking or systems awareness. But the word system is a tricky one. But that's just, a practical problem we all have to face. Once people get it intuitively and once they see and get involved in actually doing it, arose by any other name. The label becomes less and less the problem. But initially, it can be a problem. And the second problem is the word thinking. For most of us, we think of our thinking as a cognitive conceptual process, and we miss the emotional underpinning. One of our teachers was a very eminent quantum physicist named David Bohm, Bohm. David wrote the most widely used book on quantum physics for about 2 or 3 decades in college level physics. David used to say, we really should have a word called felts in English, because you don't have a thought without a feeling, and you don't have a feeling without a thought. The two are always woven. It's our capacity to think and feel. They always show up together. one of the big shortcomings, and I'm sure a lot of the people watching this as educators are very tuned into this, because one of the things that's really propelled the social emotional learning world is the increasing acknowledgement, particularly a problem in the mainstream Western, I would say, very mentally centered culture that, oh, really, feelings are always there. It's not like I don't have them and then I have them. There's zero evidence for that from a brain science standpoint. Believe me, the feelings are always there. Right now, there are just as many feelings as there are thoughts. And as David used to say, they're always conjoined. They never arise separately. Even though we may be dimly aware of the feeling, interest, I'm thinking about something that's interesting to me. See, that's the emotion. It's always there. The feeling and the thought are never separated. So that is really tricky because this word systems thinking tends to lead people to think, well, it's all a bunch of conceptual skills. So you tell them stories about the iceberg, or I talk about stocks and flows. Those are tools at one level that are conceptual until you use them. And then you realize when the kids start to distinguish the surface of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, some events that occurred, like a fight on the playground or a conflict, a political conflict in our community, um, that's not separate from the underlying structures that are shaping those events and the emotions, thoughts, histories, relationships embedded in those structures. So we have this phrase systems thinking, and both words are problematic. We've kind of gotten around that in two ways. One, we use now much more the term systems awareness to suggest that it's an awareness that's both rational and affective or emotional. It's embodied. Some emotions are embodied phenomena. There's somatic phenomena, as well as it has thoughts associated with it. So awareness is a little better term. Um, so I think that those are, that's kind of the nature of the territory. And the reason for the connections with SEL, which have grown steadily now in the last 10 years, we have a paper recently published on cultivating the innate systems intelligence of children in a leading SEL journal. The advocate for it was a woman who's now the chairman of CASEL. Many people know her, Kim Schernert-Reichel, a leading practitioner and researcher on social emotional learning. Because Kim is convinced that if we can knit together the systems perspective with SEL, we'll have something very powerful. The downside of SEL is it gets cubbyholed as emotional regulation. What teacher doesn't want their kids to be more under control emotionally? Of course. So that was a big selling point of SEL, executive function and all these things. Um, then, of course, there's the relational part of it, right? So most teachers are very tuned to the idea that, well, if my kids can get along with each other, if they can help each other, if they can learn together, if they feel more safe amongst each other in a classroom, this will be a better classroom. That's an intuitively appealing idea to a lot of teachers. What this all misses is that if they learn to think systemically, they can also understand history differently. They can also understand science differently. The examples that naturally we built on all along, like that national state park example I was telling you about, all weave together science, math, civics, different subjects woven together as they are in fact woven together in real life. When was the last time you encountered a real problem that was just a math problem? Or there was just a personality problem? They're all woven. So that's why people like Kim in the SEL world are so enthused by kind of, you might say, broadening the pot in which we've planted this particular seed. It's really not just about social and emotional. It's about systemic self, the world of self, the world of other relationships, and the larger world of economics, society, ecology. These are all different levels of systemness. There's a single coherent idea that weaves all.
Yeah, I find You were speaking to what happens in most classrooms where let's sit down and we're going to do history and and we never stop to check in, how are you feeling today? What's the social field, is a term you use. A lot of people are saying the word vibe to kind of, if they aren't familiar with the term, but
Right.
how it changes the dynamic in a classroom and maybe where a teacher can begin to do that. I think, that also is a point that, the framework brings in about compassion and how that's different than empathy. But it's just to have a teacher stop and acknowledge, oh, I've had a rough morning, I'm showing up differently, but,
Yes.
your bus was late, or whatever might have happened that changes how you're showing up.
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, so that's one of the things that kind of comes out of this naturally is, the humans in the classroom, the ones that are adults to the ones that are kids, are humans in the classroom, and they have an equal legitimacy to be who they are and be where they are right now. Usually really good teachers, this is one of the thresholds they've crossed. They realize they are themselves. Every day they're different. The subject may be the subject, but who they are teaching the subject is going to be day by day. And they learn ways to create a legitimacy for themselves to show up as people. You don't have to make a big deal about it, but a little comment, because the kids get it, right? Even if they're young, they're intuitively very sensitive. We're social creatures. We're very intuitively sensitive to someone's happy, someone's stressed, someone looks unhappy. They look like they don't really feel very well. Even those short comment like, gee, it's good to see you kids. I'm not feeling the greatest today. Just acknowledges that. Usually masterful teachers have learned a lot of different ways that they can kind of create, you might say, the space for themselves to be who they are and where they are right now, just as they need to create the space for each of their learners.
Absolutely. So, thinking about now teachers beginning to be more transparent and acknowledge that they're human. You talk about the need to show up with head, heart, and body fully engaged. I'm also in my work real notice that when a teacher slowed down, because oftentimes when you talk about social emotional practices and tools, everybody immediately thinks, oh, these are for the kids. But when you say no, you can create space to
Yes.
reflect before you
Yes.
step in the classroom, and your self-care, because it changes. What I found surprised them was it changes how they show up for each other as teachers and people within the organization. So would you mind maybe sharing a little bit about how reflective practice, or this acknowledgement of how we're showing up, has an impact on teaching teams across
Yeah.
schools or organizations to build something new and significant changes, since
Yeah.
again we know people who are going to be listening might be in the process of doing that kind of work.
Right. Well, first off, I think this taps a kind of, you might say, a broad awakening that is not just about our work in any way. The SEL world has opened it up. Continuous improvement efforts in school have opened this up. Many things have opened this up. Is that one of the professional challenges, I believe, in the field of education is we've tended to inherit a highly individualistic point of view. Now, I can say a word about this from a business standpoint, having worked in the business world for a long, long time. There was a big transition in the business world. It kind of unfolded slowly, gradually. It was really picking up speed in the 80s with what was called at that time quality improvement and continuous quality. But the idea was very simple. People work in teams. The key learning unit, the key unit for improvement, the key unit for real change in any institution is not one person, and it's not one person and their boss. It's a working team. It's a group of people who need one another to get something done. By contrast, by 20, 25 years ago, you could see this movement had really started to become ingrained in the business world. It was still completely foreign to the education world. I'll never forget years ago hearing a teacher in a state of frustration say, when I close that door, I'm God in my universe. I'll never forget that line. And she was in a moment of frustration, which is perfectly understandable. But what she was expressing was that, well, once I'm in my classroom with my kids, that's where the work really begins. So that image of the isolated individualistic teacher and her or his kids is kind of an iconic professional image in education. And it's a big problem. So I think I'm not saying anything that's radical or new today. Thank goodness. Like a lot of people have caught on to it. We realize that how teachers work with each other, the development of grade level teams, of other things like this is really important. It enriches the professional work environment of the professionals, although it's not easy. Working in teams is never easy. But, a lot of things that are really worthwhile in life are not easy, right? So
Right.
it's challenging, but it can be very rewarding when it's successful. Um, and and so, not surprisingly, if you want to bring about basic innovation in the classroom, what we concluded years ago strategically, you start with the adults. You don't start with the adult and kids. You don't, we've never been into creating curriculum and teaching teachers how to deliver the curriculum because you haven't done anything to change the culture of the school. And if the curriculum is not very radical and it's an incremental improvement on things you've been doing, no big deal. But if the curriculum is really different, like social emotional learning, guess what? How long does it take the kids to recognize that an overstressed teacher who doesn't feel much colleagueship with their own peers is not very credible teaching us about social emotional learning? Kids get it right away. And of course, one of the things that's happened ironically with the SEL movement is because it has become a bit of a fad. Teachers all, go to the 3-hour SEL training and then they're supposed to start to deliver it. What I remember, forget the term, it's probably not new to many of you, but it was new when I first heard it. Drive-by PD, one teacher called it. Like you just drive by, you get your PD and you go back to work. So the idea that how we cultivate a social setting, what we often call a social field that's healthy, nurturing, and generative amongst the adults, in order for them to be good teachers working in the same territory with the kids, is a big idea. It's missed in most SEL, which again is chunked into the same way we chunk most stuff. This is like math or science or a new approach to civics. Train the teachers, then the teachers go off and do it with the kids. And I mean, it is incoherent. It's profoundly inconsistent when you take a territory like SEL, which is about the social environment and our own experience as emotional beings in that social environment and the interaction of the two. Guess what? If you don't start with the educators, forget it ever having much impact on the kids. So I think that's been a big awakening for many people that poorly done SEL is probably worse than no SEL
Hmm.
because the kids quickly pick up the incongruity, the hypocrisy, teachers telling us how to be better at managing our emotions, that I see them going off all the time on each other, frustrated and not able to deal with their own conflicts. I first started to understand this from a practical standpoint when I visited the school of a master education leader. Her name is Debbie Meyer. Many of you may have heard of her. She was quite famous in Philadelphia, Boston, New York as the mentor of principals. So many of the best principals in those school systems were mentored by this one lady named Debbie Meyer, Meier, if I remember. She became one of the founders of the Coalition for
Mhm.
Essential Schools with Ted Sizer. Anyhow, I visited Debbie's school once. It was a small school. She loved small schools. She had started so many schools, and then the people there would eventually become principals and go off and with their own schools. And the first thing you noticed in Debbie's school is there were no offices. The administrators was a small school, so there was a principal and a vice principal and maybe a couple of teacher leaders, something. There was a kind of a simple hierarchical structure, and if I recall, it was probably 500, 400 or 500 kids in the whole school. It was just a K to 5 school, if I recall. Anyhow, but he walked into the office, where the administrators hung out, desks in one room, and I said, Debbie, how do they like this? She said, oh, they hate it. Everybody wants a private office. They can close their door. He said, but it's critical that the kids see the adults doing adult work. It's critical that the kids see the adults having a debate or an argument. It's critical that they see the adults using math to do their budgets. It's critical. So her view was, unless the kids saw the adults doing what the adults were teaching, then the whole thing lacked coherence. It was just the adults blah 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 blah. So that's when I first realized that no, all real innovation in education has to start with adults. The kids are not the problem.
Yeah, I noticed also in her schools that oftentimes students had leadership roles and they would greet people coming in the door. And that because I think we often underestimate the capabilities of children, which goes back to the article you mentioned about we don't recognize the ability of young children to understand connectedness. I know you oftentimes share an example that is, pretty astounding, where young boys are able to resolve issues. So would you mind sharing maybe an entry point, a teacher, if they recognize, the need to embrace this, how they could get it started in the classroom, or what they might expect from, the student examples, so that we don't underestimate, or we, I guess, better grasp their innate ability in a true sense?
Yeah. Well, this goes back to the basic puzzle I was saying before of why this is such a tricky territory, because most of us as adults never had anything like this in our own education.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So now all of a sudden we're trying to introduce ideas and practices that seem challenging to us, because they are challenging to us, but are actually much easier for the kids. The example that Faye was referring to, which was a little video, actually came out of the same community, different school than I was talking about before. But that community, which is in the Tucson area of Arizona, became a real hotbed for innovators across the K-12, PK-12 spectrum. And this is a video that was sent to me by one day, and I never forgot it. And for many years, it was the video that I most often used. It was 3 6-year-old boys who had sat down after having a fight on the playground. Nobody asked them to do anything. They came in and they sat down at a little table, put a big piece of paper on the table, and drew a feedback loop to try to understand why they were having fights all the time. And they were having fights regularly, and their feedback loop. And anyhow, and there's just 3 boys sitting at a table after a recess, or at the end of lunch break. They just came in early because we got to do something about all these fights we're having. And a teacher walked by and said, "Can you explain it to me?" Just took out her phone and filmed it. That was it. That was the video. And you can hear the teacher's voice in the background, because at a couple points the teacher asked questions. The little chart that kids drew was really simple. It had mean words, hurt feelings, and it was a vicious cycle where when they had some mean words, then they had some hurt feelings, then they had some more mean words, then they had some more hurt feelings, then they had some more mean words, then a fight would break out. So they were trying to understand this, what we would call structure. That's an example of this technical term I used before, underlying systemic structure. When you go down that iceberg from the events at the tip of the iceberg that everybody sees, the fight on the playground, to the fact that, well, these kids, they're having fights regularly. There's a pattern that's going on again and again. They're having fights. To why? That's the underlying structure. So this was the kid's attempt to understand the underlying story. Anyhow, so the video is about 2 minutes long. It's really priceless. And in that paper we was referring to, we just described it in a little brief form in the introduction to the paper and gave a link to the video. One of the boys, again, this teacher's walked by, "Would you explain your loop to me?" That's literally what the teacher says. And the kid says, "Well, this is why we're having the fights in the playground, blah, blah, blah." I said, "So we tried saying I'm sorry." And up at the top of the chart, there's a little phrase, "I'm sorry." We think it kind of works. We don't think it's very high leverage. And then they went on to proceed to describe the different things they have tried to break the loop. That's their language. We're trying to break this loop. It's a priceless example of real systems thinking. In other words, these kids have built a little model to understand their own behavior, not somebody else's, their own, in a very real predicament. So anyhow, that was another one of the artifacts that had a big impact in the growth of this field. People were stunned when they just watched this 2-minute spontaneous conversation of 3 5-year-old boys, 6-year-old boys, and the sophistication of their ability to reflect. the sophistication of their ability to step out of an emotionally challenging situation and look at, well, what's really going on here? To recognize the emotions, but not be caught in them. It's quite something. I've literally had people say, couldn't we send those kids to Washington? I mean, they're just stunned by the difference between 3 6-year-olds and our typical adult abilities to deal with conflict. So yeah, that's been an important artifact. And again, it has two messages. One is it's a very natural thing for the kids to do. You can see these are kids are having a 6-year-old conversation using 6-year-old language around a 6-year-old issue, using a tool that's very intuitive to them. And secondly, the role of the teacher is not trivial. Here, the teacher is literally just filming it, but they're explaining it to her and they're asking her questions. They're asking her for feedback, her for perspective. So you now see a very different, and I would say in the ideal of a lot of teachers, healthier relational space. The adult is an adult. The teacher is a teacher. The teacher has authority, but it's not the authority of commanding people to pay attention. It's the authority of lived experience and perspective. It's meaningful for the kids to explain their loop to a teacher because they are really interested if what the teacher has to say. The teacher asks them questions, which helps them think more deeply. So it illustrates a totally different relational space. And I think oftentimes teachers are worried that, collaborative learning, project-based learning, they lose authority. I think it's quite the opposite. They can gain legitimate authority. Kids know they're kids. They know they are not adults. What they are really fed up with is adults trying to command them to tell them they must do this or that, rather than being real thinking partners with the benefit of the adult's experience and insight.
I agree. Again, in my experience, showing that you're learning alongside them in many ways, I think, can make a big difference when you're transparent and say, let's investigate that together. You've brought up something interesting. And I think, that carries over to, again, looking maybe now at that organizational level, whether it's in school or an organization. How do you, recognize your biases and embrace and be transparent in order to do some difficult work at times or make changes that maybe not everybody's in agreement with.
Right. Well, first thing to recognize, it's actually hard.
Yes.
And it's hard because it's hard. Learning calculus is hard. Learning to play the violin is hard. These are not easy things. You don't master them in a few tries. Oh, I tried, it didn't work. Yeah, I tried playing the violin, it didn't work. That's that. We would kind of laugh and say, well, that's kind of absurd. The amount of effort and time and patience needed to learn the violin is not trivial. We understand that. The same is true in working with teams and building a healthier adult learning community that can really create, as Faye said before, a more generative social space. This is really hard work, which then points out a very simple but very basic problem. We would not give the kid the violin and say, show me tomorrow what you've learned. Oh, by the way, a week from now, you have a recital. I mean, we wouldn't do that because we know it takes time. We know it takes patience. We know it takes encouraging feedback. We know teachers play. We know all these things. We do not organize our school so that the teachers and the adults in the school and the administrators have the time they need, nor the skills and coaching and support needed to develop their ability to learn together. Because we think it must be easy. We think it must be a matter of just good intentions. Oh, our team doesn't work. That's because, so-and-so is a jerk. We totally forget that this is an area of highly skillful behavior. There is a field called organization development. It's a critical part of every management school, mainly taught in business. Occasionally in ed schools, it creeps in a bit, but it's based on the simple fact that this is not a trivial domain. How you build a team that can really learn together, that can deal with conflicts, can deal with very complex substantive issues that are also emotionally complex, historically complex. We've done a lot of stupid things in the past, and those things are still present here. That is embedded in all the social, political, cultural complexity of our societies. It's really quite insane to think this is just a matter of better intentions. There are real skills and real practice needed. The practical question is very simply, are we organized to support that? Do we allocate the resources needed for teams to grow and develop? And it's silly to think that, well, just the principal has to make this happen. It's crazy. These are adults. If the people aren't really building commitment themselves, but then they have to have the time to do it. So that's a very complex managerial issue. And I think in the industrial age school, where your model was teaching what we've already learned and, little incremental technical additions to it, um, then maybe it worked okay. Because you learned 80% of the math you needed in college, and you kept adding another 5% and 5% and 5%, and you God in your own universe, and but if you're dealing with truly complex subject matters, you bring in reality into the school, and kids are starting to deal with the real issues they live with in their communities. Guess what? So are the educators. So that's a very fundamental educational challenge, how we actually take this sort of learning, developing effective teams in education seriously.
I agree. So CEI works with children in some of the most difficult circumstances in the world: conflict zones, immigration, displacement, extreme poverty. What gives you hope that cultivating systems intelligence, systems awareness in young children, even in those contexts, matters for the future we're all trying to build?
Well, I mean, what's the option? I mean, so that's the first question. I don't mean to be flip, but I mean, seriously, we're just going to pretend it's all going to get better? You know, we're kind of at the end of the line on a lot of issues. We live in a way in the world that's not going to be continued. It can't continue. Right now, humans, general rule of thumb or estimate amongst people in science is used about 1.5 Earths. Our material, ecological, environmental footprint takes about 1.5 Earths in terms of the total amount of resources we use, the total amount of waste we dispense, and the effects we're having on our larger world. And of course, all this shows up socially. It's not just ecological. It's one of the problems that people have. They think, oh, well, all these environmental issues, I don't need to pay much attention to those. But look at our politics. Everywhere around the world, politics become increasingly dysfunctional because people have profoundly different views about what I just referred to and have very little capacity to sort out those differences productively. So things are kind of falling apart. So I guess our option is to, we'll just let them fall apart and pray and hope for the best. Or we say, well, maybe our systems of education are really important for how a society evolves. Maybe it's not just a matter of doing more and smarter what we've been doing for a long time. Maybe we have to learn to do some things differently. I think that idea is a motivator for many educators. They enter teaching as a profession in part because they believe it's a window into improving society, into helping society deal with deep issues that are very hard to deal with. We educate for the future, not just the present. It's the only institution in society that has a 75 to 80, 90-year time horizon built into it, right? So it is by its nature a kind of portal into shaping different societies. I think that's an idea that attracts many educators at a very deep level. That said, it doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean that's what we're doing today. So, and then encountering kids in very different settings. I mean, you've worked with kids in a lot of very difficult settings. This is a difficult statement to make because it can sound almost the opposite of what I intend. There's also opportunities in those settings. In a refugee, MIT's done a lot of work with refugee education, and today there's yet another round of major collaboration, this time led by Villanova University and the Catholic Church around prioritizing, refugee education in the world, in a world that's being upended socially and politically by massive movements of people, very often because of climate change or other things that they have nothing to do with, but their local economies are collapsing. Their local political reality is following and also in collapse. So I think you meet the kids where you can meet them. And sometimes when you have less and less inherited artifacts, you can improvise. You can come up with new ways of doing things. MIT has no ed school. Um, that's also created advantages. Today, there's about, I can't ever keep track of numbers. It's getting close to 50 million kids who teach each other coding on a platform called Scratch. There's almost as many who teach help each other develop apps on a platform called App Inventor. Um, why? Well, because we couldn't work through the mainstream institutional infrastructures. We had to innovate, had to go to the kids directly. Kids can learn coding on Scratch if they can just get internet access. They don't need a fancy school. They don't even need a school. They need to collaborate, and they collaborate online. Different kids will get together around a setting where they have a platform, a way of accessing the internet. And it's a meaningful education because learning coding even at a very early age can really help you professionally. It gives you lots of opportunities, and most importantly, probably it builds confidence. Yes, I can learn. So yeah, we have a lot of very harsh educational contexts today. Um, if our model is a schoolroom and a nice, neat, tidy school, they look disastrous. If our real anchor, though, is kids learning in ways that's deeply engaging and meaningful for them now and potentially for their future. Then we go, oh, well, it's just a different circumstance. Maybe it affords other opportunities, like kids helping kids online.
Yes, again, in my experience with students in a challenging setting at a young age, by listening to them, giving them the systems, tools, or ways that they can understand very easily complex problems and challenges that make sense to them, they're having an opportunity to come up with solutions and to participate. I found resulted in a tremendous amount of self-agency and self-confidence. And they would come back and say, as a result of that, I show up different now on the playground, or I show up differently in the lunchroom.
Yeah.
Maybe not the same things happened that where I didn't like before because I feel comfortable saying, this isn't right, let's not do this or that.
We
So
got,
it
we got to
is,
do something about this, right? Rather than
yeah,
being passive. Exactly.
yeah, I think, yeah, the importance of students and young people. Okay. I also just in conclusion, it's interesting when we think a little bit about ESL, there's empathy, but I know in the framework and in your work, you talk about compassion.
Mhm.
And maybe do you mind sharing a little bit
Sure.
about why compassion has a role to play in this work and how it's different perhaps in people's mind from empathy?
Yeah, that's a confusion that is widely prevalent and is important. This was a territory that I learned a lot about from my colleague, who you also know very well, Faye, Meta Bull, who's by training a brain scientist and really understands the SEL territory more deeply than I do. She will say that empathy is a given. Here's what I mean by a given. We are a social creature. Literally, what empathy means is to feel into the feelings of another. That's all it means. Einfühlen is the German word, and German's very, very depict feeling into, literally. Um, so in that sense, as a social being, as a biologically social creature, I mean, as are all the mammals, the advanced mammals. I mean, think of, therapy dogs. Here I'm in northern Vermont. I guarantee you, one of the things that young people who are really stressed love to do here, to hang out with the cows, literally. Now, a cow is a little different than a dog, but they're a social being. And, you can have a lot of empathy across species. Think about how your dog senses your feelings. Okay? So the difference between empathy and compassion is more of a cultivated orientation to build on. Without your innate capacity to feel into, it would be meaningless. But you kind of build on that innate capacity to feel into, and literally compassion, Latin root, being with the feelings of another. Compassion, being with the feelings of another. You literally kind of use that empathy foundation to try to be helpful, to try to be a good listener, to try to appreciate and feel into the difficulties or suffering of another. Now, it's tricky because most of us have been so trained to be a problem solver. Parents are the worst, of course. You want to fix all these problems for the kids because you don't like to feel their feeling of distress. You don't like to feel their feeling of hopelessness. You don't like, and I'm saying this a very particular way, you don't like to feel their anger. But they have their anger. Compassion starts with that kind of situation going, oh, maybe my first job is not to fix the anger my child is experiencing, but to experience what it's like for them to feel that anger, to just be with the emotion. See, it's very simple to say, and it's very difficult to do. Because if I can just be with the emotion, be present for them, guess what? I could actually listen. What does most teenagers want more than anything else? They want someone who actually listens. Doesn't try to fix them because they're going through whatever anxieties and teenage stuff they go through. They're a teenager, for God's sakes. That's what you're supposed to go through at that age. You're inconfident. You're not sure you can make it work. You have very complex relationships with other teenagers who are going through all the same stuff. I remember years ago being an educator said I'm a middle school maniac. And what she was saying was, that's my choice in life. I'm best being around the complex emotional space of teenagers. It's okay with me. And her first instinct was not to fix these things, but to be with them. That's compassion. Until you can be with it, then you can actually maybe be more helpful. And we all know this, men and women, classic problem. Can't you just listen to me rather than trying to solve all my problems for me? So this is the difference between, being driven by my empathy. I feel the feeling. I've got to do something about it because I don't want the feeling in myself. See, that's the shadow or the downside of empathy. It's what Meta coined the term empathic distress. We're in empathic distress because we're around the emotions of another, which are problematic for the other. But first off, they're problematic for me. And when I'm being driven by empathic distress, if you look at it closely, your fundamental motivation is for you to feel better, for you not to feel stress, for you not to feel the anger or fear of your child. Until you can just be with that emotion, you can't move to a different stance where you can then be with the person and maybe be helpful.
Thank you very much, Peter. This has been a wonderful opportunity to learn from you and to help us all in our work with youth and in the education environment.
You're very, very welcome, Faye. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you both. I'm thrilled, actually. I was very engaged in the whole discussion, the conversation that you were having. So thank you so much, Faye. And thank you very, very much, Dr. Senge. It's been really lovely to have you. Especially, this too often overlooked topic is really important for us all to consider right now to really help young children to grow and develop in the way that we want them to, both so that they can be engaged in their present, but successful in their futures as well. We know there's a lot to learn. We need to reflect on how we teach, how schools are organized. So much is involved there. But I really appreciated our final discussion here on compassion as well, and the compassionate systems work that you are doing through the Center for Systems Awareness and the framework that you have developed there. And compassion really does, I think, begin with listening. I wish I had thought about this a lot more when I had teenagers rather than trying to fix the problem, right? They would tell me, "You're trying to solve my problem." And I'm like, "Yes, I am." And they'd be like, "Just listen to me." And I think I finally learned my lesson. But feeling, understanding the feelings of another, our world desperately needs this all the way around. So we'll continue to think more about systems thinking, systems awareness, as you have termed it, and how we can all help and support and surround both educators who desperately need our support at this time, and children, young children as well, and adolescents who are all going through living in a very complex, changing world at this moment. So we appreciate it. We also thank those who have joined us for this conversation and are listening, perhaps after the fact. And alongside this video, you'll find several resources related to systems thinking, systems awareness, and children. And we hope those will be beneficial to you all. So thank you again to both Faye, and a big, big thank you to Dr. Senge. It's really been a deep honor to have you with us. Thank you so much for offering your time. Thank you.
Very welcome.